How much did people support the war? Why do people support wars? So first of all, I'd like to think about what do you think the reaction of ordinary people to the outbreak of World War I was and why? And secondly, how could the government ensure that people supported the war? Pause the video, consider both questions before continuing. So did people support the war? There was widespread support in 1914 for World War I amongst the British people, and you can see that in the large amount of people who volunteered to join the armed forces at this time. However, there was some criticism. George Bernard Shaw released an anti-war pamphlet called Common Sense About the War, which sold 25,000 copies, but then he received a lot of criticism for his stance. Similarly, Ramsay MacDonald, leader of the Labour Party, was anti-war, but then he was forced to resign because of his position. So there was some criticism of the war, but it was often muted. However, as the casualties mounted up, particularly after 1916, support for the war generally waned. You can see this, and this led to a change of leader in 1916, as the Liberal leader Asquith stepped down to be replaced by Lloyd George, who ran a coalition national government. And from 1917 onwards, there were various war poets like Siegfried Sassoon who started releasing anti-war poems. But even this was complicated because Sassoon himself was forced to enter a mental institution for releasing these poems, and later agreed that he had a nervous breakdown and was not actually anti-war. At the same time, some socialists and trade union groups were quite anti what was going on, and there were various strikes in industry. But it's clear that overall the war was broadly supported. However, the government did put in place various measures to ensure there was support. They focused on three main strategies. First of all, they used propaganda to put across a pro-war message, and that's what we're focusing on today. Secondly, they used censorship, both to censor accounts from the front line, so people at home did not get negative messages about what was going on, and they also censored articles in the UK, for example, censoring the railway magazines because they felt that if the Germans got hold of them, it might give too much information about British transport network. Lastly, they did not report bad news. So, for example, when the British battleship HMS Audacious was sunk in October 1914, it was simply not reported in the news. Now, many different forms of propaganda were used during World War I to spread the positive messages. Newspaper reports were controlled. Photographs and paintings of positive messages from the front were shared. Posters, postcards and cartoons were released to try and push the government's positive messages. Official films were created. And lastly, authors produced different books to support the war effort. So to start off with, newspaper reports were very important at this time because they were the people's main source of information. Initially, reporters were not allowed at the front and could only report on things that the government had told them. But later on in the war, more reporters were allowed to the front and given some access to frontline troops. However, they only used positive language about British campaigns. So, for example, they very rarely mentioned that someone had been killed, instead saying that the British had fallen, made the final sacrifice, or sometimes slaughtered by the enemy, clearly either trying to give positive messages about their deaths or trying to put the blame on the Germans. And newspapers remained heavily linked to the war effort, with many newspaper owners being very patriotic, including Lord Beaverbrook, who owned the Daily Express, who became a cabinet minister from 1916 and was the Minister of Information in 1917. There were also a great deal of photographs and paintings of the front line. All sides had official photographers at the front, though Britain had fewer than Germany or France. But what was photographed was heavily controlled, with initially the photographers not allowed to take photos of dead or dying soldiers. Later, official war artists were appointed to provide propaganda paintings for back home, still trying to give positive messages to the people. The third form of propaganda was posters, postcards and cartoons. And you can see one of the British government posters here, clearly implying that the German nurses were cruel to the British as they lay dead and dying. Now, in the first year of war, between 2 to 5 million of 110 different posters were issued, so it's clearly a major focus for the government. So it's very powerful, as there's no TV or internet, so this is the main way that people saw images from the front. And the main focus was on persuading people to volunteer by highlighting German atrocities or people's patriotism. So, for example, there was a whole series of posters all about the shelling and bombing of Scarborough, where innocent civilians had been killed by the Germans. One of the most famous examples of a series of postcards was called Telling the Story, showing a young soldier's return from the front in a very positive light as he spoke to his family and friends and seemed happy and joyous about being able to go to war. Official films were also created. There are many different cartoons, such as Britain's Effort, which was made in 1918 to give positive messages about what was going on, and also to mock the Germans. However, the most famous film was The Battle of the Somme, which was made in 1916. Now, it was actually shown while the battle was still happening, which clearly shows it was not all taken from the battle. And we now know that many of the shots were shot in the UK in a studio, and it actually gave an overwhelmingly positive message about the Battle of the Somme, which to many was one of the worst losses for the British Army in World War I. However, it was hugely successful, with many people in Britain having a very positive message about this battle because they saw this positive propaganda film. Lastly, the government used books as a form of propaganda. Many authors signed a declaration by authors in support of the war, including the Sherlock Holmes author Arthur Conan Doyle and Rudyard Kipling. Now, they would produce patriotic publications for no fee to support the war effort. The University of Oxford actually produced a 5-volume book explaining why Britain was justified in going to war. This was called the Red Book. And you can see how popular it was because it sold 50,000 copies. So did this propaganda actually work? Now, this is obviously very, very hard to judge because we don't know directly the impact it had on people. However, we do know that people generally remained very supportive of the war. And that we also know that many people saw pro-war films and bought pro-war newspapers, so clearly they identified with these pro-war messages. Also, most of the people carrying out the propaganda were doing it voluntarily, which shows that they supported the war and wanted other people to support them. So in summary, people generally supported the war, though became disillusioned the longer it went on. The government encouraged people to support the war using propaganda, censoring information, and limiting bad news to keep up morale. The propaganda used included control of newspaper reports, positive photos and paintings, posters, books, and films. And actually, we know that the propaganda was seen or bought by many, implying that it had a positive impact. So lastly, I'd like you to consider this statement. The government was wrong to lie to people during World War I. So, how did the government lie to people during World War I, and try and be specific? What were their reasons for lying to people in World War I? And lastly, do you or disagree with this statement, and why? This has been a Flip Your History video. More information and more videos are available on TES if you search Flip Your History, or for more information about Flip Learning and my Flip Learning journey, go to Twitter at Flip Your History or my blog flipyourhistory.wordpress.com. Thank you for listening.